The training ward tasted of ozone and boiled copper. The star chart hologram in front of me shimmered like a wound that refused to close. They taught you to turn that shimmer into a road for 1,000,000 souls. And after a year, I folded it wrong. This is what failing Navigator training did to a person who was meant to steer humanity. My hands remembered the brass even when my mind did not. The helm slab was cold against my palms, a ring of raised glyphs where fingertips were meant to rest. Each glyph thrummed in a different register, like a distant choir tuning to impossible keys. I pressed my thumb into one of them, and the chart answered, a silver filament tracing a corridor through broth-dark space. A tutor, Marius, thin as a wire and patient as a guillotine, leaned in until the scrape of his breath filled my ear. He did not touch me. His questions were sharper than his hands. Anchor, point, depth, current, anchor again. I could feel the tutors as pressure behind my eyes, like glacier weight. Their training methods threaded into my head with soft steel, memory prompts, anchored phrases, the rhythm you use to quiet the warp's urge. They taught you to stop thinking of the warp as a thing and to start listening to it like a shipmate. They taught you to braid yourself into the currents until the shimmer was a road. For some cadets, the braid held. For me, the warp silk frayed at the edges. When the exam started, the hall cooled as if the world were holding its breath. The proctors dimmed the ward until only the hologram shone. The exam was a folding lesson, a forced convergence of multiple routes into a safe passage. We had rehearsed the geometry of it 1,000 times. Take the external eddy, pin the flank, fold under the second seam. In practice, it felt like breathing in water. You had to find purchase where there was none. My line was ink-slick and precise for the first half. Other cadets' filaments flared like comet tails as they found anchors. Their tutors nodded in tight, efficient movements. I set a midfold, trusted the rhythm, let the helm breathe with me. Then the shimmer skewed. Something in the seam heaved like a held breath released. I misread the vector by the width of a thought. A misread in training was a small thing. In warproots, it could become an unsolvable arithmetic of death. The proctors did not shout. They had no need. One of them, an old woman with eyes like carved coal, tapped at the panel, and her face did not move. Her voice was an incision. "Cadet Aaron," she said. Marius' presence skeletoned into the space behind me. The ward felt narrower, as if the walls had learned to lean. They flagged my name with a formal sequence, a thin red halo pulsing on the chart, the kind of mark you could never unsee. Procedure directives cascaded through the ward systems in a practiced rustle. Assessments, secondary readings, a registry note that moved like a black moth across the tutors' displays. They read the options aloud in the dry neutral cadence of bureaucracies that handle lives like paper. Remedial cycles they offered. Reassignment. This board may recommend procedural mitigation. Words softened the knife. I had heard them all before, in prior seminars and whispered corridors. Remedial meant extra cycles, more nights with the helms lab, tutors leaning so close your spine felt measured. Reassignment meant a posting under someone else's hand, steering convoys that scraped along the rim worlds. Procedural mitigation. The phrase landed like a final coin in a slot machine. It smelled of disinfectant and sealed doors. The tutors spoke it as if it were a tool, precise and necessary. The rest of me heard the smell, old metal and slowly burning paper, which translated clearly into exile and erasure. There were reasons these choices existed. One misread could cascade into a ship lost and scores dying. The training regime was not cruel for cruelty's sake. It was a machine honed by the expectation of catastrophe. Still, when faced with the ledger of what I had become, the options felt disproportionate. The word Navigator had been chiseled into my name since I could first steady a bead of light on my palm. My family line had bent around the expectation of warp-sightedness. To be offered formalized unmaking felt like being unstitched in the middle of a garment. Marius' jaw tightened. He had voices for pity and for protocol. "Remedials could fail you again," he said softly, the kind of quiet that does not aim to comfort. "Reassignment keeps you useful. Procedure prevents future harm." His hand hovered near my shoulder before drawing back. The tutor's fingers had the heat of a thing that must not touch. I wanted to grab him just to feel something human. Instead, I tugged at the helm, and the chart flittered like a living map offended. The proctors performed their roles without flourish. The elderly woman's fingers moved with bureaucratic grace, issuing forms, conformance prints, the digital signature that made fate legal. Their faces were neutral because they had to be. Emotion could contaminate the process. But in the way the ward's lights stilled when they reached procedural mitigation, I read the softness that no policy line would ever admit. A concession to the cruelty of necessity. They gave me a minute to choose. The ward's clock kept time with my pulse. Before me, the hologram showed the folded lane I had broken. The filament vibrated like a mistake still making decisions. I imagined, absurdly, the ships that would have trusted my hands. I could picture families in cramped cabins, children quieting at a steady hum I had been supposed to keep. That image was a hot coal in the palm of my skull. Remedials promised return. I could spend another year learning where my braid had come loose, threading myself smaller, more careful. I could put my hands back on the brass and hope the seam would hold. Remedials were a slow, humiliating climb. They were also a chance. Reassignment meant stepping away from the Helms lab, but not away from purpose, guiding convoys where charts were kinder and stakes less absolute. Procedure meant wiping the signature of Navigator from my record and from my mind, or at least smearing it so thin no warp site could read it again. They called it mitigation. My blood called it betrayal. I tried to imagine what mitigation would feel like. The tutors would say it was a surgical excision of the neural conduits that interfaced conduit to helm. They would frame it clinically, like severing a damaged cable. In reality, erasure lived in the small things. Memories braided out like worn thread, the dulling of the impulse that once pulled constellations into meaning. You would wake and no longer feel the warp as a second heartbeat. You would still walk and speak. You would still be technically alive. But the part of you that had once mapped roads between suns would be a clean absence, like a label removed from a shelf. They presented the forms with a serenity that made my skin prickle. My signature would close the file. The tutor's eyes asked me to be reasonable. The proctor's hand waited on the holopad, patient as a stone. Outside the ward, somewhere deeper in the academy, other cadets were still learning how to braid their minds. Somewhere else, a ship was anchored by a navigator who did not make mistakes. The system bent around both truths. In a small, stubborn corner of myself, I felt like the last person who could argue for my own existence. I thought of the way the helm slab had hummed when I first found a clean anchor, the warmth at my temples, the sudden quiet in the tutor's questions. I thought of Marius' face when I had mended a bad fold in practice, the way his jaw unclenched. That memory felt like a currency I could still spend. I could let them sign me away. The procedure would be clean, efficient. They would call it mercy, call it necessary. I could accept reassignment. I could fold my hands and become something smaller that still served. Or I could refuse and make a mess. The minute ticked down. The chart's filament flared and then dimmed, as if matching my faltering certainty. My fingers moved to the hollow pad not to sign, but to slide the file open, to read the clauses in the proctor's slow legal hand. The letters were polite about endings. They spoke of conserving fleet integrity and preventing catastrophic loss. They imagined their actions as the preservation of more lives, but their words could not reach the private geography of a ruined ambition. When Marius spoke again, his voice lacked the surgical calm of the proctors. "There are risks to refusing," he said. "You understand that?" He did not need to finish. I understood the ripple effect of a single failed navigator. Ships misrouted, time convulsed, lives unstitched. I also understood the other risk, the one no policy would admit, that mitigation might not be mercy at all. It could be a sanctioned annihilation of the thing I had been born to be. My hand hovered over the pad like a hesitating spellcaster. The ward smelled of ozone, boiled copper, and the faint sweetness of fear. The tutor's eyes watched for the shape my decision would take. The proctor's hands were ready to finalize whatever I chose. I could hear my own breath as if it were a separate cadet, steady and small. I did not sign. I did not accept the managed unmaking on offer. Instead, I pressed the pad to call for a private conference. It was a small procedural loophole, thin as a reed, that would force a delay long enough to change the calculus. I could not tell you then whether I chose delay out of hope or stubborn pride. Perhaps both. The act was impulsive and deliberate at once, an admission that I would not be erased without a fight. They frowned. The proctors' neutral faces narrowed in practiced dismay. The request triggered another set of protocols, a slow legal shudder that would buy time but also draw attention. Marius stepped closer, his mouth a tight line of worry and something like approval. The ward's lights shifted to a cooler white, more watchful now. The chart's filament settled into a pale, tentative glow, as though acknowledging the pause. I felt the ward breathe around me, its systems rebalancing. Outside, the Academy's corridors would hum with their own indifferent activities. Inside, I had made a small, decisive motion that would force movement in a different direction. I had refused the immediate erasure. I had refused the neat mercy of mitigation. What I had not yet decided was where refusal would lead me. To remedials, to a new posting, or to something more reckless. The proctors cleared their throats. The pad blinked its mandated acknowledgement, and the tutors leaned in as if to listen to the next thing I might say. They eased me from the helms as if they were removing a sputtering animal from a cage. The straps unlatched with mechanical patience. Cold air found the places the helm had protected, and everything felt too loud. The soft staccato of my breath, the distant clank of a servitor's arm, the tiny clinical voice of an intern who announced a ledger entry like a benediction. "Sanction," she said. Short, practiced. A thumbprint, a seal that pulsed against the soft meat at the base of my skull. The ledger accepted me the way a machine accepts a misaligned cog, with interest and no mercy. They did not say fail. They never said fail. They called it containment, a neutral word wrapped in sterile linen. Containment absolved them. Containment justified the rest. They walked me down corridors that smelled faintly of oil, ozone, and something sweetened. Call it cleaning solvent. Call it a prayer burned too long. The reconditioning ward was not one room. It was a ledger made manifest. Cells lined in tiers, each with a thin bed, a listening grate, and a small window that showed nothing but a shimmer of corridor. Light here refused to choose color. It sat flat and bright, the kind that makes your skin look like a map of fatigue. Technician. No. An engineer, she corrected herself, as if language could sharpen authority. Slid a gray hood over my head and spoke into the fabric. Her words became immediate, like an extra sense grafted on. They called that overlay a phasic feed. The feed threaded into my temples through the little junction the ledger had left behind. Voices moved over me then, not loud, not necessary. They were precise, clinical, and they had the patience of tools. Pulse and surface, one voice said. Isolate pattern. Remove recurrent sync. They sounded like engineers with knives. Meticulous, detached, a rasp that promised incision with no blood. The overlay described what it would do, as if narrating weather that would pass through me to change the climate inside my mind. I lay very still and listened to how they planned to translate my failures into procedures. They framed their work as correction, as neutral surgery. They would not let the warp remain personal. Everything personal, they had decided, was dangerous. Isolation began as silence, and then made itself into pattern. My cell hummed. The hum had a frequency that vibrated under my teeth, a low private rotor that rendered the world a little softer at the edges. At first it was a mercy. Later it became a talking thing. The warp found the small spaces and spoke into them like a neighbor tapping on a shared wall. At first the whispers were patient and distant. Then they recognized my name. It is one thing to hear the warp as geometry, and it is another to hear it use the cadences of memory. The first time a whisper took the shape of my mother's voice, I thought my mind had broken clean in a place that was only mine. She smelled of frying oil and last summer's sun. The voice slid a detail into me, a crooked seam on a coat, a promise of bread. And it made the warp less abstract and colder, an intimate presence with hands. I could have reached back and found her in that sound. I did not. Instead, I counted the tiles in the ceiling until the words passed. They scheduled corrective measures in clean blocks of time. 2 days for sensory reconditioning, 5 days for neural pruning, a single hour for an operation they called the unweave. Each name had the bluntness of an industrial tool. Everyone used them like pliers, no flourish, no moral commentary. The unweave, they said, would untie the learned folds inside my mind, would separate the warp patterns I had stitched myself into during training. It would leave the warp sense serviceable but safe. They promised less noise, less danger. They promised a navigator who could fold without being folded into return. I learned to mistrust promises softly made. The first procedure was listening. They placed an array along my temples that tasted faintly of metal and old sun. Soft speakers pressed against my skull and fed silence into the places where the warp used to sing. It felt like someone rinsing a wound with cool water. The engineers droned instructions through the phasic feed, and the sound of their voices became a scaffolding. My mind began to do the thing they wanted. It measured, it cataloged, it closed off pathways. Between calibrations, I woke in the old way, the way the helms had taught me. With the world like a folded map, creases where time might be pierced. The warp's whispers now took the form of thin, persistent questions rather than promises. Why did you stop in the middle of a fold? Why did you hold pattern A with your left hand and pattern B with your right? Who taught you to hum the underfold and bless it with rhythm? The questions had a childlike curiosity that made them more dangerous. Children don't think of consequences. The warp did not have to. They sent a man once into my cell, only one who wore a badge that told me nothing because it refused to be read, and he left behind a small object on my night shelf. It looked like an old cog, worn and useless, but when I picked it up, it hummed a tiny private song against my palm. The phasic feed registered the anomaly and quieted. The man had smiled without teeth. He could have been a test or a temptation. I kept the cog anyway. It fit in the curve between 2 fingers, a private thing. The reconditioning ward had rules with teeth. No external contacts, no unlogged objects. Silence at lights out. They enforced obedience the way a tide enforces the shore. I kept my head down and learned to let their presence be a tide. The ledger took notes on me, ink that I could not see. The engineers talked as if they were operating on something amorphous, and I realized I was the thing they were folding. There is terror in being described clinically. One night, the warp changed its approach. It stopped whispering and began to sing patterns, short, repeating motifs that fit around the humming of the ward like insects around a light. They were not words anymore. They were maps. The melody would settle like dust into a corner of my mind and then expand, filling the space with roots and ladders and keys. I could feel old folds opening like doors within me. Fear did not come first. Awe did. The world opened like a metal box that had been rusted shut. For a moment I thought of the helms, of the cold pressure against my temples, the way the warp had been a sea I could swim by intuition alone. That night, the engineer who oversaw my case entered with a tablet and a syringe, her face lit by the screen's blue. She collected a sample of my sleep patterns and read them the way a cartographer reads coastlines. Adaptive anomalies, she told the others through the phasic link. Persistent entrainment to non-standard loci. Recommend escalated unweave, they would escalate. That word fell into me and folded itself there. I imagined procedures whose names I had not yet learned. A cauterizing of synaptic tangles, a cold graft of a new anchor somewhere sterile. They would rearrange what I knew of the warp and leave me capable but smaller. They would scalp away the parts that had learned to make home inside the currents. They would not accept the cog in my palm. I started small acts of resistance. In the mornings, instead of reciting the coordinates they fed me through the phasic overlay, I whispered different numbers, random, meaningless sequences that tasted like mint and bad paper. The overlay corrected them, but sometimes the warp took those noises and braided them into a new melody. The cog seemed to vibrate in sympathy. I hid the cog in the hollow of my mattress and pretended ignorance when the technician asked to see my storage. She glanced at the bed like an instrument, then moved on. Those were brittle defenses. The engineers had tools already humming in their pockets. They could skim thought like a surface skimmed for oil. The fear in my chest was precise and hot. It sharpened my memory of other decisions, smaller rebellions that had lasted because no one had noticed their seams. A refusal to sign a form, a joke told at the helm. Smallness had kept me alive through other storms. Now, contained in a cell, I had to choose whether to make a noise big enough to be heard and big enough to be punished. They placed a notice on my door one dawn, thin and informative. Unweave scheduled, EO 300 hours. The feed pulsed with it. The word sat in the room like a clock about to strike. All the ward's noise softened, as if the building itself were holding its breath. I looked at the cog in my clenched fist and felt the decision like a weight in my gut. Resistance would cost me. Submission would cost me more, I thought. But I also understood how easy it was to confuse cost and consequence. My mind did not choose in one breath. It assembled possibilities the way the helms had taught me to assemble a fold. Layer, test, collapse. I could attempt to slip past the guards, move through vents I had only seen on blueprints, and find a way to a shuttle. I could hide the cog in my mouth when they sedated me and let it slip through their scans. I could let them unweave me and learn to be small and safe again. Each option had a tally of likely endings written in the ledger's silent hand. Outside my door, a transport servitor moved with its habitual clank. The ward's hum deepened. Time, which the helms had taught me to fold and conquer, now reopened into a strict line. Each minute was a bead on a string. I had learned to move through the warp with grace, but moving through a ward required different skills. Subterfuge, patience, the ability to make the right quiet sound at exactly the right time. I tested my breath and found it steady enough. My hand relaxed around the cog. Its warmth seeped into my palm, a tiny map of lines and wear. The warp's latest melody threaded itself through my skull like a coaxial cable. It did not threaten. It simply offered routes I might not have imagined on my own. I could submit. I could lie back and let them open me like a clock, let them remove the parts they named dangerous, and then step out with new seams and a ledger-colored life. I could be safe. I could breathe without the warp learning my face, or I could resist. Not the wild, romantic resistance of novels, but something grim and practical. Hide the cog, memorize the melody the warp sang, and hum it back at an unexpected time, a time when the FASIC feed thought me sleeping. Make the melody into a key and use it to jam a scanner, to confuse a procedure, to buy an hour. An hour might be everything. I lay there and let the possibilities compile. Outside, the ward light shifted from clinical white to a pale, indifferent blue. The engineers' voices in the feed drifted on, the tone of a choir that believed itself inevitable. The ledger stamped my future in small, cold increments. When the lights began, the day's soft change, I slipped the cog beneath my tongue and tasted metal and old oil. It was small enough to be a secret and heavy enough to be a promise. I did not know what the next hour would require of me. I only knew the movement I would make when the ward came for me. I would not let them unweave me without a sound. The first time the lesson tore, I thought it had been my fault and nothing more. I sat with my palms pressed to the cold glass of the simulator, feeling the ships hum through my bones, and I told myself a dozen neat excuses. I was tired. My focus had faltered. The pattern had been wrong. The tutor's voice had been clipped but patient. He waved a hand as if dispelling a minor spill. The air tasted faintly of ozone and hot metal. Then the lights dipped, and the whole room folded like a wet page, and something inside me flickered in response, like a candle caught under a jar. I hid that flicker. Hiding it became a practice. I learned the routes no one watched, maintenance crawlways that breathed the warmth of engines, cargo shells where crates hummed with static, a narrow service ladder that rose behind water tanks and led to a discarded maintenance loft. There I practiced folding alone. The first time I gagged on the warp smell that bled through, acrid like burned incense and deep sea salt. My hands trembled, and I bled a small dark smear on the floor that dried like old ink. I kept the smear and learned to read it, to tell when my own pattern was jagged and when it was merely tired. I learned to smooth the edges, to slow the flare-ups with small, forbidden tricks. They were all half-measures and superstitions from broken tutors. A thread of insulated wire looped and whispered over a palm. A strip of polished glass pressed to the temples to dull the spark, a little sigil drawn on the wrist with engine silk soot. None of it was sanctioned. None of it was taught in any manual. Each trick left a residue on the ship's instruments, an echo in the sensor logs. I became adept at brushing for those echoes, erasing, smoothing, recoding. I learned the ship's audit pattern like a child's lullaby and folded my false readings into it. For a while, the system swallowed them. Small things began to go wrong. A crate manifest listed a dozen spare coils twice and 3 crates of ballast not at all. A loader cursed the sudden shift and rerouted a pallet by hand. No one blamed a recruit for manifest noise. Then a shuttle missed its berth at the outer ring. I watched it on the maintenance screen, a tiny white dart, and felt the knot rise in my throat when the clamps failed to lock. Metal screamed against metal somewhere outside the hull. Sparks painted brief constellations on the bay lights. The shuttle swung away like a fish on a broken line, and the pilot cursed in a voice like a torn cloth. No one was hurt. That was the problem. If someone had been hurt, the blame would have been obvious and loud. Because nothing burned and nothing died, everything could be rewritten. The tutor found the trace of tampering in a way that felt too precise to be luck. He had the patience of a ledger and the humorless curiosity of an archivist. He summoned me to the mapping chamber, a circular room that smelled of old paper and machine oil, and he let a log scroll in front of me until the fault was visible. A few bites of pattern had been smoothed. A series of fold hours had a blank where there should have been a record. It looked like a smear on glass. His eyes were dull, like flint softened by long use. "Who practices without oversight?" he asked, and the room seemed to shrink to the distance between his words and my lie. I lied poorly. My palms were sweat-wet, and the lie stuck at the edges like dried resin. He watched me the way someone watches a thing that breaks and must be repaired, not cruelly, but with an economist's sadness. He spoke of protocol as if it were a hymn. He reminded me of the cost of mistakes made in secret. He kept his voice low. It made every metal joint in that chamber sound loud. Then he told me gently that concealment was a different kind of failure. A public error could be mitigated. A hidden one could metastasize. After he left, the room felt hollowed. Security rats, hard-faced crew who smelled of disinfectant and gun oil, moved through the corridors more often. Their boots were a new drumbeat. Whispers threaded through the mess and through the cold birthing racks. People I had nodded to in passing began to look at me as if I were a reflection with a smudge. I caught snippets: liability, observation, special handling. Those words carried a weight that changed the shape of the air. They did not mean simply extra training. They meant doors locking, manifests audited deeper, names written down in thick ledgers. I had thought they would throw me into the school's low-level tasks. Instead, the tutors convened a panel and put their pens on the line. There is a very particular dread when you discover that you are worth more dead than you were alive. I had imagined expulsion. I had imagined scorn. I had not imagined the station at the edge of the tutors' maps, where they keep things that cannot be allowed to spread. Someone older than most of us once muttered that the warp will claim what goes unguarded. My secret made me a potential vector. I understood, with the slow horror of learning a new instrument, that the custody of knowledge within the fold is as much about containment as it is about learning. The more details of the pattern you could see and not tell, the more dangerous you became. I knew too many ghosts of currents and the spaces between stars where currents thinned. Concealing rather than conforming had felt like agency at first. It felt like choosing a narrower pain over a wide, administered one. But danger doesn't take well to being polite. My deception began to press against the ship's skin. I learned that with every false override I planted, I stretched a thread further into the ship's systems. Those threads met other threads. They tugged at things that were supposed to be immovable. A manifest changed, then a shuttle missed a berth, then an auxiliary coil ran hot because a maintenance ghost had been told the wrong schedule. Each incident layered suspicion like rings on an old trunk. Then a tutor ran a cross-check and found my handprint in the logic. It was not that I had been discovered in the act. I had been implicated by the pattern of things I had touched. They stopped pretending it could be contained. The tutors began to speak in contingency plans during lessons, as if rehearsing lines from a play. If an unregistered fold occurs, one would say, and the pupils would pass a nervous look like a shared illness. The word remove slipped into conversations and sat there like a cold stone. I watched faces author a calculus of what to do with a recruit who knew how to make the warp obey, or at least how to coax it, but refused the discipline of the hall. Some of the older cadets looked at me with an expression I had never seen before. It was not simple fear. It was envy sliced with something like predation. They wanted what I had, but not the danger that came with it. I tried to bargain with the truth. I offered to open my readings for supervised sessions, to let them watch the flare-ups like a lab experiment. I offered to submit myself to the long, grinding process of reconditioning. The tutor considered this like a manager considers budget cuts necessary and never fully sufficient. "You do not understand the way these things spread," he said. It was true. My fingers itched with the knowledge of corridors of influence, the way a misfold here could produce hunger elsewhere. My curiosity had always been more voracious than my caution. It was what had brought me here. It was also what could not be tolerated. So I kept folding. I practiced smaller, craftier concealments. I learned to fold with a counter rhythm, to give the ship only the shape of what it expected, while I pulled the true pattern inside a sealed loop. I found a place near the old cargo lift where the hull met an auxiliary field, and the noise of the engine swallowed small anomalies. There, beneath a lattice of dust and the steady thump of the boilers, I folded into a corridor no one mapped. It was a blind in the ship's sensors, a gap the book said should not exist. The first time I slipped through it, my mouth tasted like iron and rain, and a heat like a recorded memory licked the inside of my skull. I came back with a reading I could not translate completely. It hummed in my bones, a phrase without a grammar. That phrase became a plan. Not a plan to prove myself, not a plan to petition the tutors, but a plan to make the only useful demand left to someone labeled a liability, leverage. If I could show them the corridor where a fold could be steadied, if I could guide a sanctioned tutor to a place where the warp bent kindly instead of raggedly, then perhaps they would keep me alive for the value I introduced. Perhaps they would keep me close and chained rather than distant and erased. It was not noble, it was practical. It felt like using a wound as a weapon. The risk was simple and sharp. To bring a tutor into an unmapped fold would be to admit my secret, and to admit it would anchor me to their appetites. They could study me, dissect the way I bent the pattern, and then they could sell the technique or hide it and call it their discovery. Worse, if the corridor proved a hazard, I had given them me as bait. Still, action tasted like air compared to the stifling of waiting. I crafted a way to present my case that did not look like confession. I would not approach with my palms empty. I would show them steadied data, a controlled fold I had rehearsed a dozen times in the belly of the ship. I would make the corridor speak in numbers. On the night I chose to act, the ship smelled of oil and the distant smoke of a welder's lamp. The watch was thin. I wore a maintenance coat that carried the faint perfume of solvents and the official scuff marks of a loader. In a dead pocket, I carried a strip of glass I had scored and polished until it held a tiny lattice of refracted light. It was a cheat, a small amplifier for the pattern so that the instruments would see what the tutors wanted to see. It felt like smuggling sunlight into a cellar. My heart beat like a machine starting up. I moved through corridors with purpose, past sleeping racks and the hushed argument of two cooks, and kept my breath shallow. I reached the gap in the sensors and set up the amplifier on a crate. The small room was all shadows and the whisper of the ship's life support. I folded and called the corridor with the precise private grammar I'd taught myself. The space answered. It felt kinder than before, like a friend with a scar. The instruments on the amplifier sighed and threw a readout in pale, obedient lines. Stable, narrow, containable. My hands trembled because the tutors would not simply accept stability, they would want to own it. They would call for study teams and disciplined observers. They would strip whatever privacy I had left. When the tutor's voice crackled through my ear, authorize a level 2 observation, 20 minutes, I had to decide whether to bring them there as an offering or to use the moment to vanish. The ship's skin seemed to hold its breath. Behind me, the corridor hummed its quiet answer. Ahead, the tutor's arrival would mean admission. Behind, disappearance would mean a chase through a ship that knew all its hidden paths better than I did. If I ran, I would be running from more than tutors and ledgers. I would be running from the knowledge I had weaponized into my survival. I could feel my body's old training press at me. Keep your hands steady. Do not let the pattern know your fear. I wiped my palms on my coat and forced my voice smooth into the comm unit. Request observation, I said. The words were small and precise. I sent them, and then I did something that frightened me more than anything else had. I left a single breadcrumb in the ships. Manifest that only someone who understood the fold could find. It was not a call for help. It was an invitation. If they took it, they would come with boots on the deck and pens poised. If they ignored it, I would carry the knowledge with me like a map to a locked door. I stepped back from the amplifier and folded once more, lighter this time, to smooth the edges of the readout. The corridor breathed like a living thing. The life on the ship continued, indifferent. Above, a shuttle cycled somewhere. Engines coughed and coughed into rhythm. The tutor's reply came like a distant bell. Arrival in 5. My stomach turned and steadied at once. This was the moment where hiding became a choice with teeth. The corridor behind me hummed a promise. The corridor before me was a path I had carved. I felt the thin line of my failure and my leverage taut between them. I walked away from the amplifier and toward the sound of boots. My palms were scorched with remembered flame. The option I had chosen was not to confess nor to flee, but to drag them to the place that made me dangerous and ask them to look at it with their full, institutional eyes. I thought of the ledger and the lists and the way tutors had said, "remove," with the casual cadence of advocates listing options. I thought of the corridor and the way it had held me like an answer. If they came with pens, I would speak. If they came with chains, I would run. Either way, I was no longer merely a failed recruit hiding flare-ups in the dark. I had set a hand against the ship's hull, and the echo of that hand would call them to me. He said the word like it was a coin I could flip and spend. Pardon? Quiet. A house name wiped clean from the rolls, a boat ticket out of the spires. The offer did not sit like salvation. It weighed like a ledger, numbers on one side, names on the other. And in the chest of that balance, my life trembled, or someone else's did. I had bartered pieces of myself for years. I charted blind lanes through eddying warp sheen for smugglers who paid in coin and grudging favors. I lent captains a crude sense of where their holds would reappear after a fold, and they repaid me with cold nods and promises I never trusted. Each map I ghosted into being took something. A star in my mental sky dulled. A waypoint that once snapped bright now throbbed like a wound. You could feel the giving away as a physical thing, like thread slipping through fingers, fine and endless. By the time Voss found me, by the time he offered his paper absolution, I had already been trading my claim to a helmsman's seat for the rust of other people's freedom. Voss sat on a crate beneath the hanging lanterns of the outer quay. The light made the scars on his hands look like cartography. He had taught me for a season at the school, before the instructors decided I did not fold right and I did not belong. He knew how the warp felt under my skin. That was why he wanted me to pass on one of my own. "You owe me nothing," he said. He had that steady, dangerous softness that men with power keep for favors. "This will be yours." I thought of the school, of the way the folding lesson had broken the first time my hands tried to drag the corridor of stars closed. The instructor's face had drained, like a ship losing ballast. The bench had felt like a voice pulling itself from my throat. Every time I tried after that, there was a new wrongness. Stars bending where they shouldn't. Memory hiccuping like a ship's hull in a shudder. I failed, and failing mattered. The houses are not sentimental about potential. Voss's breath smoked in the cold. He tapped the ledge with a finger. The rhythm was patient. "There is a student there," he said. "Riva. Smart, dangerous. She asks questions that cost me favors, Let her be found answering those questions in a place they will not forgive. You arrange the trail. You do not need to be seen. You fold her path for the inspectorate to find. He made it sound easy because he had the machinery of the world behind him. He forgot that for a navigator, even a small fold is intimate work, like cutting a hair from someone's head and threading through their future. I imagined Riva's face, sharp in a way that made adults wary, leaning over a console, humming numbers under her breath. I had watched her once, from a corridor, when both of us were still learning the ways the mind could map the stars. She stood where I could not. She had a stubbornness that was a kind of cruelty. I won't be seen, Voss assured me again. You will send her where the patrols look for traitors. They will take care of the rest. You will leave with your name cleansed. It was the same bargain every desperate person takes. Sanctuary in exchange for someone else's exile. I had the taste of it already in my mouth, salt and cold metal, and it did not soothe. I thought of how my talent felt when I gave it away, not the mechanical act of mind-bending. I remembered the quiet aftermath, the soft thud in my gut when the last thread of mapping unwound. Smugglers cheered like they had saved me when I set a course that kept them from Imperial checkpoints. But the gratification was always small and laced with shame. I could measure the currency, freedom now for a future I had let go. Voss offered the same calculus, but compressed. One fold, one person, my salvation. The ledger wangled into black ink instead of red. I pictured the fold I would have to perform, not the elegant, clean snap the instructors taught in the halls, but a pocked, off-balance fold that would put Riva in a corridor where suspicion would be sharpest. The warp remembers who uses it, and it gives back what it takes. To move someone so that they appear to cross a forbidden line required me to borrow precisely from my remaining stock. But my remaining stock was thin. I had already bled edges of it into alleys and black market holds. Each use was like sanding away at a carved sigil. Soon there wasn't enough of me left to form a true helm. I closed my eyes and listened for the shape. When the warp is near, the air tastes of copper and old rainfall. The corridor between stars hums like a string under tension. The shape was not a voice. It was a press against my jaw, a smell of ozone that tugged at memory. When I tried to find it now, it felt ragged, where once it had been a seamless cloth to fold. I think that is the truest cruelty, failing not in a moment, but in degrees, so that you do not notice how unfit you have become until a teacher's face shows pity like a blade. You know what they'll do to her, I said. The words left me like stones. They landed where they might, and I could not bear them back. Voss' hands did not stop their work. He knelt and loosened the band on his own wrist, revealing a pale, practiced scar that ran like a seam. We all know. You will be gone before the wheels grind. You will be given a small house berth on the edge of a convoy. I will handle the appearance of things. It was not enough. The act itself could be clean from his perspective. For me, it would be a mark burned into memory. I would have traded one shackle for another. The temptation was huge, because there was a pragmatic part of me, honed by hunger and cheap lodging, that wanted nothing so much as to stop being hunted by the school. I wanted to sleep without listening for the scan of uniforms. I wanted the dignity of having a name that was not murmured in the back alleys. Why me? I asked. Why not somebody who still has their house behind them? Because you can fold, and you will not be missed, he said. Because you have been folding for coin for years. Because you owe me. That owe me was the hinge. The favors Voss could collect were not made of kindness. They were made of a quiet ledger only he could set right with a single stroke. He had carved me into the world, and now that the world no longer had use for me in proper terms, he offered me exile instead of death. He thought of the universe as a series of adjustments. I had been careful for a long time. Illicit folding is not like petty theft. It reaches into the weave of other people's lives and it is never without consequences. I had always chosen routes that blurred, small help rendered to desperate crews. This would be different. This would require me to choose a life or death line for another mind. That single thought made my stomach flop sideways. "Riva has friends," I said. The sentence was an accusation and a plea. People who will look for her. People who will connect the trail back to you. To me. So they will mourn, Voss shrugged. And you will not see the mourning. There it was. His honesty. The man did not pretend to be moral. He only promised practicalities. Survival, toggled like a switch. For him, the moral calculus was a tool, not a weight. I walked the quay until the lanterns blurred into a single streak. The wind smelled of metal and distant engines. Smugglers laughed in a bar and the sound snagged like wire on my nerves. I tried to think of the folds I had performed like a ledger of sins and services. Each fold had been small, a help to a captain, a theft from a patrol, a small stitch in a garment that I hoped could cover me. The stitches had become a pattern, and the pattern was beginning to unravel. There was another thing that Voss did not know. Or perhaps he did, and he had factored it into his willingness to bargain. When I fold for coin, I always leave a small misdirection, a half-trace that I can pull back from later. It is a superstitious habit, a small moral itch. If something goes wrong, I can sometimes tug the thread and change the ending. It has never been enough to save someone from the inspectorate. It has never stopped a machine already set to grind. But I had learned that small acts of sabotage could create room. I thought of using that habit now. I could arrange Rivas' misfold so that the patrols found her, yes, but not without a way out. The plan would be dangerous. It would require me to risk being seen, to weave false evidence in visible places and stronger counter-evidence in shadows. It would require me to stretch the last of my skill like a frayed rope and hope it did not snap. If it did snap, there would be no house birth at the end of it. There would only be the school's judgment and whatever cruelty that entailed. The choice condensed into a single cold fact. Betray Riva cleanly and live, or betray her with a safeguard and gamble my life to spare hers. Either way, I would be trading pieces of myself. One path promised a slow, comfortable exile. The other promised something closer to penance. I sat on a rusted coil and tried to hear the shape again. This time, when the warp brushed against me, it felt like a hand that could be either an ally or a lash. It had contours I could still follow. Not enough to coax a grand fold, but enough to push a little. The smell of copper returned, sharp and clean. If I chose to try and save her, I would need specifics. Voss had given me a target time and a mention of a patrol route. He assumed the inspectorate would follow standard practice: seize, interrogate, transfer. That left an interval, an hour, perhaps two, between discovery and adjudication. Those hours are where people live or die. I could slip a whisper into the right ear, misplace a key datum so the chain of custody broke. I could drag the patrol's suspicion away from Riva for enough time that friends could find her. But friends were not guaranteed. If Riva's friends could not react quickly, the gamble would leave her alone to whatever methods the school employed pre-judgment. I saw her face again. I could gamble knowing the stakes and the slim odds, or I could betray her and collect a clean pardon and an untroubled berth where I would eat without counting coins. I thought of freedom as a geometry. For me, it had been a small triangle, house promise, a seat at a helm. Failure had turned it into a broken shape. Voss offered a tidy line to close it into something like a square again, and yet the line had a person attached at one end. I had no illusions that my name would ever be whole again in the school, but I could still decide how I would live with the damage. The wind pushed a flake of ash into my mouth. It tasted of rust. I rose from the coil and walked back toward the quay, where Voss waited with his ledger hands. He looked up as if deciding he had been right to make the proposal. The lanterns carved his face into planes, and I could see the calculation as plainly as if it had been chiseled. "He'll do it," I told him, and the words tasted like the metal air. "But not your way." His eyebrows rose the fraction of a degree that meant profit or peril. "Explain." "I will create a trail," I said. "A trail that looks like it's led by me and my old debts. But I will seed a break in the linkage. Something small, intelligent. It will look accidental to anyone following the patrol's records, but it will give an outsider a breath to act. You risk being seen. I know the risk." Voss clasped his hands together. "If you fail, you fail, and there are consequences," he said. "You understand that?" "I understand," I said. "But if I succeed, she lives, and you still get your quiet pardon. The inspectorate thinks they've won. You keep your advantage." He studied me as if he were weighing my soul. For a long moment there was nothing between us but the salt air and the creak of a tethered hull. "3 things," he said finally. 1, you do this alone. 2, you don't contact her. 3, if you fail, you will come to me and I will finish this as we agreed. When he said the last, it sounded less like a warning and more like an insurance policy. He was offering me a rope and saying the other end would not hold. I nodded. I had already made my decision. It felt like walking toward a precipice that might still have a ledge on the other side. There was no moral tranquility in it. Only a small, stubborn refusal to let my last act be purely selfish. I would risk my life to leave a crack in Voss's design. I folded my scarf tighter. My hands thrummed with the thought of the work ahead. I would have to touch the warp in a dozen tiny ways, whisper the wrong note at the right time, tug a signal that would mislead for just enough minutes. It would be delicate and dangerous. It would be the kind of thing that, if done poorly, would make a list of graves. I walked away from the lanterns toward the grim hive of transit booths and registration lines, toward the place where a manufactured accusation could be planted to look as if the school had done all the work. In my mind, I already felt the shape of the fold I would attempt. Not a clean banishment, but a pause, a little pocket of time. I was not sure if the shape would let me keep what I had left. I only knew I could not make the trade Voss first suggested and call myself anything but complicit. My breath fogged in front of me. The world beyond the key was a lattice of glass and steel and the faint, far glow of convoys. I had a plan, the barest one, and a decision that would carry me forward. I could not undo the years of selling small pieces of my gift. I could only try to use the last of them for something other than my own escape. I stepped into the first flow of people and let my mind feel for the warp, careful as a surgeon. The shape answered like a half-whisper, and I began to map the tiny misdirections I would need to lay. My fingers flexed in the cold. The folding lesson had broken once. I did not know whether I could rebuild it enough for this. But I walked with purpose, and the next move was to go back into the school's shadow and make a careful lie that might save a life. The metal beneath my palms still remembered the contour of a helm I no longer wore. It remembered the pressure of sanctioned hands, the way a patron's crest had once fit like a promise along my brow. My hands did not. They worked in a narrower place now, a strip of repurposed grating above a repair bay, a console jury-rigged from 3 dead nav computers and half a blackout lamp. Salt and machine oil lived in the seams. The warp lived louder. The lesson that broke had been simple in theory. Fold, ride, correct. In practice, it had been a lesson in how small errors multiply when the void answers you in voices. The fold I had trusted failed like an old joint, folding on itself and slamming us back into a world that was not prepared for what we had bent. That snapping taught me to listen and to distrust the reward that would smooth over my ruin. They offered a pardon wrapped in silver and obligation. They wanted a clean number subtracted from their ledger, and me returned to a chair I could not rightly sit in. I refused. Refusal did a number of things to the life I had planned. It tore the name Navigator from my title card. It shut house doors that once swung open at my presence. It stripped me of the gilded helm a house might have crafted, the symbol of comfort that compresses 1,000 voices into a manageable tone. It traded all of that in for small, granular permissions, licenses forged in backroom ink, favors traded for the scent of boiled coffee, a ledger kept under loose floorboards. Where I had promised institutions, I now promised people. The warp had changed too, after the breaking. Failure did not bring muteness. It intensified hearing in strange, lopsided ways. Instead of the organized choir a house helm taught you to expect, I had a chorus ragged with wanting. The voices came ear-splinter sharp or soft as moths, slipping between the clacks of the station's pumps. They did not speak in coordinates so much as in needs, tangled with the deckhand's cough and the baby that would not sleep. Sometimes the sound of old metal creaks would bloom into a lunar sigh that told me nothing useful. Sometimes a single thought of a pilot's fear laid the true vector on my tongue. I learned, painfully, to pull the useful thread and leave the rest. That listening is an imperfect mercy. It makes me precise in places that matter and wildly wrong elsewhere. It gives me a way to feel the tide of a fold on the edges of a mind that is no longer sanctioned, but it also feeds me with fragments of lives, shards of grief that can make me fold first for people and second for policy. It has ruined any hope I had of being ordinary again. It has also, paradoxically, allowed me to steer in ways a house would have called reckless and holy at once. So I took work that did not glitter in the official manifests. I patched the compass fittings of a freighter, carrying heat seed through a nebula where the Admiralty refused to send convoys. I pulled a burned-out astrogation core from a transport and braided its failing echoes into a coherent path. I navigated one corroded civilian liner away from an orbital whose governor decided fewer mouths would ease his tax ledger. I altered manifests, delayed patrols by a few minutes, whispered in the right ear of a refectorium clerk, and watched a ration crate find its way onto a list of essential repairs. Each job was a small moral stain and a necessary repair. Each job was also an argument, made in the dark, about the direction of one life against 1,000 inked directives. People ask, rarely and quietly, what a failed navigator does when they cannot claim the warrant and the heraldry. I did not teach children to read charts. I did not settle into a comfortable exile. I made myself useful where the warp's hearing and the world's practical needs overlapped. I became a fixer of courses and a smuggler of chances. I learned to keep my eyes on the human shape of things rather than on the elegant geometry of a sanctioned fold. That choice cost me safety. It saved other things. There were moments of pure, petty humiliation. Supply clerks who remembered my house, dockmasters who still spat the old ranking, priests who touched me with a finger like a rebuke. There were nights when the pressure of the warp turned sour in me, and I slept in stolen chairs, dreaming of the helm's comfortable brass. But those humiliations were small against the clarity that came when a child in a crowded hold stopped crying because I had found a path that kept us 3 degrees off a mining surge. That clarity tasted of diesel and tears and the quiet approval of a life not written by someone else. It is a strange economy, trading title for touch. Institutions buy obedience with symbols and appointments. They pay in breadth but demand depth, your loyalty to a ledger's tallies, to the cleanliness of a plan. I traded breadth for the brittle, crucial thing of being able to make a tiny difference where difference mattered. I could no longer claim the title, but I could reroute a hungry convoy into a safe port. Once you have rerouted a convoy of half-starved people, the ledger looks less like truth and more like a set of convenient numbers. The law is patient. It loves to wait. A house counselor, an embittered tutor, or a low-ranking adjudicant might one day notice a pattern. A civilian freighter delayed, a ration crate slipping away, an orphan transport that found a harbor. The sanctioned world keeps its eyes wide and its purse strings tighter. So I made my work furtive. I taught a small network how to read the noise without a helm, how to balance on it with the gentleness of a surgeon. We patched radios to carry code. We taught captains how to hum a simple frequency that would lull the warp's attention long enough to fold. We named rendezvous points with the kind of care the law reserves for sacred oaths. Names had to be kept few, messages sparse. Trust became a currency smaller than coin and harder to counterfeit. There were benefits beyond the moral ones. Without house oversight, I was less constrained by doctrine. I could fold around a personal plea without filing a report. I could bracket a patrol's route to give a trapped miner 3 hours more oxygen. I could listen to a woman's prayer and let her words determine the angle of the gap I would open. I acted in increments, 20 seconds saved here, a half degree here, until a life leaned farther away from the edge. Those increments accumulated into saved calendars, birthdays, debts unpaid but lives kept. But the warp exacted a price for every mercy. Its echoes lodged in my skull like burrs. There were nights when I could close my eyes and still hear the hiss of a fold unaccounted for, a laugh wound tight with metal fatigue. Sometimes the voices washed over me in waves so raw that I staggered from consoles, hands on metal, breathing as if I had just broken water. These were the moments that taught me humility. I had once thought mastery a destination. Failure taught me mastery's shape, not a crown, but a tool, always slipping, always demanding attention. Not everyone believed in the shape I chose. Old friends accused me of romanticizing suffering. Analysts argued that my small interventions were a drop against a tidal bureaucracy. They missed what failure had showed me, the particular geometry of a human life that never appears in statutes. A family's letter tucked into a conduit was worth more than a year of house speeches. The child who would ruin a mechanic's day to bring her a painted pebble at the dock later became the one who repaired my broken relay when I could no longer afford a technician. The exchange was not commerce. It was the less tidy currency of mutual people-saving. The day they came with an offer I could not accept. Politely was the day I knew my life had tilted beyond the point of soft return. A junior attaché from a house I would not name brought a packet of clean paper and a seat that almost fit the old arrogance. They wanted me back, or at least the skill I had discarded. They offered reputations, credits, a possible restoration under their terms. Their voice was engineered to sound like a path home. It smelled of kiln heat and old varnish. I heard it only as a new chord in the warp's messy symphony, an institutional hunger. I folded the packet, tucked it into a tool chest, and walked away. I could not give myself back the submission that had been demanded. I also could not pretend the head turn of their envoy did not matter, or that their resources would not have bought safety for a dozen ships. The choice was as sharp as any course correction. So when the message came over the patched relay, soft, compressed, the kind of code only those who listen could parse, I answered without consulting ledger or sanction. It was a string of names and a single place marker near a warp-scarred shoal. They had a convoy there, civilians mostly, their astrogation knocked out by a pulse, while a mining syndicate and an adjudicant oversight fell into argument. They had asked for lawful help first. Law had been busy. Law is busy most days. What they had not done was calculate the cost of waiting. I had a ruined emblem in my pocket and a conscience that echoed like a chapel bell. I also had ears. I could hear the shuffle of fear in the convoy's hold, the whisper of ration seals being opened and resealed, the faint, unwavering request that threaded between them, a petition that did not beg for glory, only safe passage. The warp supplied the vector in broken fragments. My work would be to stitch them into a continuous line long enough to carry them across. There is always a pressure before a fold, a physical tightening that feels like a hand closing on the heart. I felt it then. I could have counted risks. I could have cataloged sanctions and long-term cost and what house retribution might look like once the convoy reached sheltered waters. I did not. Counting in that moment would have been something a house would expect of me. Counting would have been obeying the ledger. Instead, I gathered instruments, lit the patched lamp, and ran my hands over the jury-rigged console until the warp's chorus steadied enough to teach me the angle. I chose to steer them. The engines warmed like a living thing. The bay doors breathed their slow, mechanical sigh. Around me the crew, small, hands stained, eyes lit with the fragile trust of people who had nowhere else to go, prepared in the way that prepares do not always show. A sheathy, tightened bolt, a whispered blessing, a last shared cigarette. I felt my world narrow to the line I would draw between here and there, to the fraction of degree that would carry vessels out of harm and into a chance at ordinary days. I did not pretend the fold would be clean. I had failed at that belief long ago. But failure had taught me another kind of lesson, one that did not end with sanctioned glory, but began with the simple, stubborn work of keeping people afloat. I set the course, fingers returning to the rhythms that had once promised me a gilded helm. The console hummed, the warp's voices gathered like stormlight. I drew a breath and began to fold, not for houses, not for titles, but for the shape of a life I could not otherwise save.